Dear friends, a warm welcome from the European Movement's offices here in Brussels to this new edition of Investing in the Future of Europe, which forms part of a series of events held over the last 4 or 5 years together with the European Investment Bank and the European Movement International. The objective of these events are to bring stakeholders from across Europe, from the EU institutions, the bank, civil society, the private sector, to discuss some of the key issues that are currently at the top of the agenda. And of course, what more important than the discussions around the climate crisis and how to mitigate climate change. And today's event will be dedicated exactly to that. We want to look at the actions that the European Union needs to take to implement the commitments that international partners took in COP26. And to have this conversation, we're fortunate enough to have an impressive lineup of speakers with us who bring varied degrees of expertise on the subject from very different perspectives, but all of them carry with them years of experience on the subject. First of all, I'd like to welcome Raffaele Mauro Petriccione, who is the Director General of DG CLIMA at the European Commission. Thank you very much for joining us indeed. Alongside him will be Eila Kreivi, Director and Head of Capital Markets Department at the European Investment Bank. Thanks a lot for coming indeed. And last but not least, Petriccione Brink. He's a Deputy Secretary General and Director of EU Policy at the European Environmental Bureau, one of the biggest networks of environmental NGOs and a member of the European Movement International Network. Warm welcome to you too, and Happy New Year indeed. Thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedules to join us. Perhaps I can start with you, Mauro, and maybe ask for your impressions for the conclusions from COP26. What do you think were the greatest achievements? Were there areas where we could have had better results? And what do you think from the European Commission's perspective, who played an active role in the negotiations about the outcomes of COP26?
Thank you, Petros. And before I answer, thank you to the European Movement for this invitation.
I think these first.
Very good events, and very happy to be able to contribute. Look, nobody can really be happy after a COP these days. We will not be happy about the result of a COP for decades. This is a transition which in Europe is going to take 30 years. In other parts of the world, it's going to take longer before we can say with confidence, we have stopped climate change, now we need to work to reverse it. So the question is not, are we happy or not? The question is, would a COP produce a sufficient number of commitments to bring us forward towards our goal? And then the question for us will be, how do we make sure that people actually stick to those commitments? From that point of view, Glasgow wasn't bad. We have 84+% of the world GDP committed to a long-term goal, which is compatible with the advice of the IPCC. Are all those commitments equally solid? They are not. But they're there, and we can work on them, and we can follow up. More important, everybody agreed in Glasgow that in order to get to those commitments in mid-century, you have to have a nationally determined contribution with a 2030 horizon that puts you on the trajectory to that. And if yours is not good enough, you need to revise it. And those who haven't produced a new NDC should do so. That's what we have done with our NDC. Not many other NDCs are compatible with their long-term objective in that sense. The US, the UK, very few others. We also agreed that we have to put in place now the policies and measures that make those NDC real. And there, nobody has them. We, the UK perhaps, have the proposals on the table. We're working on those measures. Others are still thinking about them. We need to agree domestically what are the policy and measures. In Europe, we have to finalize the Fit for 55 package. Others have to do the same. But we have committed for the first time to do that. We have committed that the objective is 1.5 degrees maximum and not between 1.5 and 2 degrees, and that makes a huge difference. And we have committed that by 2030, collectively, we should reduce emissions by 45%. We would have liked more, but 45% is important. We've almost delivered on the 100 billion. There's been 2 years pandemic and stopping economic growth in the meantime, but we're almost there, and we're confident we can get there this year. And we have reopened the debate on adaptation finance, on loss and damage, with the prospect that this is no longer a way for people to shout insults at each other, but to have a constructive discussion. Now, is that good enough? It's a very good step forward if it happens. If it doesn't happen, we're back 4 years. So the work for this year is to make sure that people who show up at COP27 don't restart the debate as if Glasgow had not existed, and come there ready to showcase real results on those commitments. But that will have to continue every year. Every COP from now on has to be a COP that is another step on the right trajectory. And there will be step backs and there will be step aside. And I think we have to be aware of that, but we have to fight that.
Indeed, I guess the proof is in the pudding, as the British say. And we can come back to some of the things that you raised throughout our discussion. But perhaps I can pose the same question to you, Eila. What's the feeling at the European Investment Bank, not least because you play an important role in financing efforts to mitigate climate change? But what was the feeling in the bank during and after the outcome of the COP26?
Thank you. Well, first of all, it seems like very far away in the past already, I have to say. But I think I can share some of the previous speakers' feelings that, of course, there were disappointments in the COP. We didn't quite get everything that we wanted. There were some last-minute changes and last-minute sort of games being played. But yes, the work needs to continue, and I think one good thing is there was more attention on adaptation, and EIB also announced a much bigger commitment to adaptation, which I think is a kind of a country cousin always of the mitigation that we talked about, because we need to invest also in adaptation for the damage that has been done already, like we saw in the past couple of years. We have seen the bushfires, forest fires, we have seen the huge floods and the damage that they have done. And this is done already by the climate change that has happened. And we do really need to pay attention to that as well. So that was on the positive side. Looking at things from my own angle, I am working in the capital markets of EIB, so I'm a financial market person. I work with banks, I work with investors. And I think that these people are already making quite a lot of commitments. Quite a few of them are making also not just a commitment that they will be somewhere in 2050, but they have a plan, they have a transition trajectory plan. And sometimes it feels a little bit, maybe I'm a bit biased towards the people that I work with and have worked with for decades. But sometimes it seems to me that the finger is being pointed very much at the corporates, at the governments, at the banks, at the investors, and then sometimes governments take a little bit more relaxed view on their own side. And I think that is something that I felt a little bit in the air at the COP, but this is something that concerns certainly everybody, be it mitigation, be it adaptation. Adaptation especially is government's business. This needs to be done by all the parties, and the work needs to continue. And I think we need to think seriously about the transition and those trajectories. And also, I think we have to remind ourselves that what we have committed to is 1.5 degrees by 2050. The commitment was not 3 degrees by 2100. Those are different trajectories and different transition plans. So we have to remind ourselves what was agreed and what we are targeting, and not just to say that, okay, now we have a slightly difficult situation, let's relax things a little bit. Time is not getting more, time is getting less. And I think in that sense, one has to keep the objective crystal clear in the mind where we are going and where we want it to be.
Indeed. There is no time to waste, I guess. Patrick, from your behalf, both as a environmentalist, an NGO, but also an activist in these fields and somebody who has been leading on those files, what's the sense at the EIB around the outcomes of the COP, and what do you think we need to do going forward now?
Okay, no, thanks very much for the question, and also to the interventions of the last two speakers. I mean, from our side, I mean, we're naturally quite disappointed, or very disappointed, at the overall COP. If an assessment was done as the level of commitments, it won't reach 1.5, but 2.4 degrees. I know if you think about numbers like 2.4, it doesn't feel very much more than 1.5 on a mathematical level. But if you actually look at what it implies in terms of sea level rise, in terms of fires, in terms of floods, I think it is very, very dramatic. And it also, especially if you start looking at impacts on livelihoods and people in lots of countries. And the 2.4 is an average. And what it hides is the fact that there will be higher extremes, so 10, 15 degrees in the Arctic. And I don't know if you've been looking at it, but if you look at the press recently, there's been discussions on Greenland ice melt and also Antarctic. So it is really important. So 2.4 is not good enough, but the one positive element, I suppose, or the silver lining, is that there was a commitment to the 1.5. We feared that would be lost completely, but that is silver lining to an otherwise unsatisfactory result, deeply unsatisfactory result. The second thing to underline is that while a lot of youth were invited, they had virtually no access at all to any of the core forum debating areas. So it felt like the climate change really is about justice and for youth into the future, as well, of course, internationally. And I think it's a deep shame that there was not more space given to youth in the COP, and this needs to be addressed in the future. On the other hand, business was actually there in spades, and it was actually had the biggest delegation, even larger than any national delegation. So it raises the fundamental questions of governance and influence. I mean, none of us would feel comfortable if tobacco companies were to be there at a health conference. And of course, there are some very good and progressive energy companies, but overarchingly, the DNA and their interests are such that you can only ask questions about their influence and the appropriateness of the representation. So there, I found that was also just from both an influence and a signaling effect, deeply worrying. On the international level, it's I think Petriccione said we're almost at the 100 billion. I think we really need to look at this very carefully. It is a case of EU respect for other countries, solidarity, and also responsibility for historical things. So we really should do all we can to push that number higher. I know this has been a contentious issue between different countries. And one practical thing is, for example, now in the Fit for 55 package, you're talking about CBAM. If this manages to get a go-ahead, then it'll be important signaling-wise to use the revenues for international investments. So anyway, I think it's a step forward. I'd really hope that it won't be the 4 years back, because we don't have that time. But a lot needs to be done to make sure it's there. Otherwise, it'll be a major missed opportunity.
Yeah.
Thanks.
If I stay with you, Patrick, maybe briefly, and that's something I'm going to ask the others too, but yeah, everybody focused on the need to now act. There have been previous COPs which focused on setting objectives and targets, but I think now it is the point where action is urgent and overdue. What exactly do we need to do to get both governments, the private sector, the financing institutions, civil society also, what are the concrete steps that we need to take to actually implement what was agreed at COP26?
Okay. Well, I think there's, I mean, at a European level, I mean, we obviously need to really lead by example here. I mean, as the Director General Petriccione mentioned, we've got the Fit for 55 package. I mean, the EU really needs to make sure that the whole package is signed up to, and this is, of course, negotiations across the institutions, and also that the ambition of each element has to be positive. And here, just to underline that the commitment is minus 55 net. This is still less than what science has us suggest that we require, which is minus 65. So we need to make this work. But you also have the EU is committed, I think, very positively to the recovery fund, and I think that money, a lot of it's been allocated, or a fair amount's been allocated to climate. Not as enough in our perspective, but I think we need to make sure that that is invested quickly. And then we have another issue of first of all, there's diplomacy and communication, because basically it is all of our challenge. It's a common challenge across all stakeholders, and it's in no one's real interests to mess this up. So I think we just have to talk to each other regularly and say, this is not enough. We need to do more, and use every single tool at our influence, because we need all the stakeholders and we need all the tools. And I think Europe has done a lot, but has a historic responsibility and a historic opportunity. So maybe I'll stop there to leave space for the other two.
Indeed. Mauro, Patrick already mentioned some of the things that the EU is working on, but what role can the European Union play? As I mentioned at the beginning, the EU has been at the forefront of efforts to mobilize the international community to take action on climate change. It has put in place ambitious initiatives. Some of them might not go far enough, but certainly compared to others, there is a lot of willingness there. What can the EU do to help deliver the commitments of COP, but also encourage others to move forward? And maybe if I throw a spinball in there, what can the European Commission do to also get member states to really live up to some of the commitments?
Look, I mean, okay, I'm going to start with something, and this is not to pick a bone with Patrick, because we share exactly the same goal and exactly the same sense of urgency. And we share also the same disappointment. Things aren't better than they are. But I think it is our job is to make sure that nobody forgets their promises, maintains them, and makes further commitments. But I don't think it works if we ignore what has been done. I took up this job almost 4 years ago. 4 years ago, nobody had a mid-century plan. Now, 84% of the world GDP has. Are they good enough? No, they're not good enough, but they're there. 4 years ago, they weren't there. 4 years ago, we were happily fighting, saying that minus 40% by 2030 was the next best thing to the invention of the wheel, and everybody else has to follow. A year later, we said, sorry, no, we were wrong. 40% isn't good enough. We're going to go to 55%. Now, I think we need to find a way to acknowledge the effort that people are making, to acknowledge what good is being done, while at the same time explaining why it is not good enough, and why more needs to be done, and why things have to happen faster. Because this is an effort that our society has to keep on for 30 years. The biggest risk we have nowadays is no longer climate skepticism. But 4 years ago, there were plenty of climate skepticism in Europe. The biggest risk we run today is fatigue. That we will not be able to keep this risk for 30 years, which we have to do. So I think let's be careful about how we handle these things. I think the role of everybody, whether it's the institutions like the Commission, whether it's civil society, whether it's science, is to keep everybody with their nose to the grind. And if people have to be shamed into doing it, so be it. But we should not forget at the same time that things are being done. Now, what is the role of Europe? The role of Europe is very soon insignificant in terms of reducing emissions, but we have to do our part. The biggest role, and Patrick put it very well, is no longer just a moral leadership. We started the Industrial Revolution. We have started the Green Revolution. But it is explaining how it gets done in practice. How do you recreate in 30 years a society which is very different from a society which has built itself over 150 to 100 years? A society which is cleaner, but it's also modern, It has the technologies that we all want, and it's fairer, and it's juster than it has been so far. And I think we have an opportunity to use this transformation and the massive resources that we are devoting to it to address also some of our old ills. Just to give you a practical example, the proposal we've made on energy efficiency and a social climate fund. Okay, not everybody likes it, and if anybody has a better proposal, we'll change our mind. But we made a proposal which was designed not only not to make energy poverty worse, but to address the fact that we have energy poverty in Europe and nobody's doing anything about it. And I think that's what we need to do. It can be done. It is a big enterprise. It's a risky one.
Indeed. No, the stakes are very high, and of course the complicating factor are enormous. Maybe, Eila, maybe I'll come to you because we'll talk about what action needs to be taken and how can we ensure that all actors involved take responsibility and deliver on their commitments. And I think there is a great need for investment here in infrastructure, in cleaner energy, in people, skilling them so we can make the transition from the gray to the green economy. How can the bank, the EU as a whole, support these efforts for investment? How can we motivate the private sector, other financial institutions, both to contribute financially in this effort, but also themselves to green their operations and contribute into a more environmentally friendly and sustainable action on behalf of the private sector? How does the bank work with all those different actors to ensure the investment is there?
Yeah, thanks. I think there are two things. How can the bank work and how cannot the bank work? So first of all, we are a lending institution. We lend to both public and private sector, but we lend to investments and projects. So we are not sort of a general all-purposes lender. Also, as we are set up as a bank, we don't have a budget, we have a balance sheet. So our resources to lend are finite. I mean, they are large, but they are finite. And hence, it has been taken the decision in the bank already a couple of years ago that we will focus on the part that is the most critical, i.e., for example, the long-term transition, the long-term energy questions, the long-term environmental questions in other regards than climate. And this is our role. Now, we work together with anybody who wants to invest, but we are not the ones who take the decisions on making an investment. We are not the ones who decide to build a wind farm. We are not the ones who decide to improve energy efficiency of, public buildings in a certain city. We are not the ones who decide to build or improve public transport networks. Those decisions are made elsewhere, and we can finance them. But we have one very big advantage here. We have probably, I'm not going to play false modesty here, but I think we have the best experts in the world in the field of energy efficiency, everything to do with environment. So if a client wants to make an investment, we can advise them how to do that so that it is done with best standards, so that this is aligned with the climate targets, and so that this is environmentally and technically sort of solid and feasible. So that is our role, and we are very happy to play that role. And I think it's very important that we are not only seen as the people who have public money. In these days, you have plenty of money, public and private, everywhere. I don't think if you have a bankable project, a solid project or investment, you can find the financing. Private sector banks, public sector banks, whatever, you will have options. But you don't find the expertise everywhere, people who can advise you how to make this sort of the best standards. And that, I think, is a combination that we can offer. We have the expertise to tell you how to do things, and we have then also the resources to finance. We don't finance wholly anything. We co-finance with other sources. But this is very important that we do have that expertise. We have been there to work with the EU guidance on what is green or what is green enough. So this is our role. But one cannot say that EIB do this and that. We do not finance, we do not decide on the investments. Those decisions are made elsewhere. And when somebody has taken up their mind or made up their mind, then we can come into the picture. So one has to keep these roles in the mind, that we all have our roles to play. We don't play the policies. We are the policy bank. We finance the policy investments, but we don't we are a policy taker, not a policy maker, if you like.
Indeed. And I should add, of course, that you're free to intervene and also respond to comments made by other panelists. And you watching from our website, from YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, or anywhere else, you can also be asking your questions. My colleagues are connecting those and channeling them through, so I can bring them to the attention of our speakers. We've talked a bit about the international context. Mauro, last time we spoke, I believe Trump was still in power in the White House, and the US had withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. Things have changed since then, not least the resident of 1 Pennsylvania Street, and I'm wondering whether that has made any difference, both during the negotiations, but also in the time that has passed since then. Can you say that the US is more committed now, practically, not just in words, to delivering the commitments of COP26?
Okay, let me follow my own advice for my last answer. Of course, it has made a difference, huge and positive difference. In climate diplomacy, those who want to change things are now immensely stronger. The US has reach, which is unparalleled in the world. We're no slouch ourselves. We are doing good things on climate diplomacy, but it's very clear that the EU and the US working together have a much bigger impact than the sum of the two would indicate in terms of outreach and climate diplomacy and bringing people to the table and convince them to come on board. And I think the explosion of commitment that I was quoting before started timidly in the last year of the Trump presidency, but really took off after the US election, when the prospect of the US rejoining the Paris Agreement had become real. So that's been very good. At the same time, I think we see the US still struggling with the Trump legacy. We see that 4 years of deliberate dismantling of environmental protection and climate rules have to be paid for. I think the EPA had been completely gutted, and now it's been rebuilt. Policies don't happen overnight, even in the United States. So I think we are still waiting to see a really solid, long-term, irreversible domestic climate policy in the United States. The premises are there. This administration knows what to do. They know what they want to do. They want to do the right thing. But I think we're still paying for collectively for the Trump era. If you think of how much we have done over those past 4 years, in terms of changing our mind, adapting our policies to science, and persuading people to come on board, because we live in democracies, and democracies deliver and deliver faster than others, but they are confusing. We need to persuade people. So I think the US has made a huge difference. Things like the joint partnership with South Africa on energy and just transition would not have happened without the US on board, or at least weren't happening in spite of our efforts. The attention we are getting from some Asian countries that we weren't getting before, the US has helped tremendously on that. But at the same time, there are still things missing, and we know there are still things missing in Europe. But at least we haven't had a pause in our thinking and in our political work and in our technical work now. So I can only hope that this accelerates in the US. We know that the US has a very short and very repetitive electoral cycle that doesn't help. And we also know the US remains a country profoundly divided, and that divide affects the issue of climate change as well. This is a huge advantage we have in Europe. We have population who is much less divided than anywhere else in the world on this issue. We have our own divisions, we're not paradise, but on this issue, I think Europeans are compact, and the European youth are compact. And one should not underestimate the role that having the generation that will vote at the next election, taking to the streets repeatedly, and basically give you a very powerful message. This is not about 30 years in the future. This is about what we are going to do at the next election.
Indeed.
We haven't seen massively that in the United States yet.
Indeed, no, I would like to echo that, and I think we need to look at the efforts that the international community and of course the EU are taking, also in the context of the pandemic that we are just going through. Not just because of the challenges that it has posed, but it has also shown how interconnected and how much we need to cooperate to deliver results. And the EU has been quite swift and forceful in its response, and it adopted a remarkably ambitious, some call it groundbreaking, recovery plan to help the European economy and society at large recover from the effects of the pandemic. Patrick, perhaps I can ask you, but I'll go to the others also. Do you think the recovery plan that is currently being implemented, do you think it's an opportunity for the EU to re-engineer its economy at large and put in place a more sustainable and perhaps resilient system of running our economy and our society? Is this a golden opportunity to really re-engineer the way a European economy works?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I like to take a leaf out of the Petriccione's book and say the positive. Very much, I think the European solidarity and collaboration to get the package there has been a major success. In the early days, it was a little bit on the cards, but we have a very good success, which broke a number of economic taboos, allowing us to move forward and showing solidarity and hence supporting the European project. The COVID also led to a major rethink in terms of public policy, and made people realize how important health policy and public health and well-being was. And I think now we've moved to the case of health and environment and climate being seen as two sides of the same coin. But to get specifically to your question in terms of the ability to have a transformative change, I think that the answer is yes. I think they can be important catalysts. There was a requirement for, or there is a requirement for, a certain level of climate funding. There was a requirement for them doing no significant harm. I think, as we've seen throughout the process of the development of the plans, a lot of the plans, while they had some questionable projects in the beginning, got rid of them. There's still some weak ones. Overall, formally speaking, all of the plans met the climate targets. If you actually ask some analysts, some people will question whether they will actually reach that percentage climate funding. So there's an open question there. But the key thing in my mind is there has been monies allocated, and these need to be actually spent, because just because it's an allocation doesn't mean it will be necessarily spent. So it's totally beholden us to make sure it happens, and then it has to be spent in exactly the right way and the right time. And I think, just to underline a few points, I mean, there's a commitment in most countries on investment in building energy restoration, and this is hugely important for climate. It's hugely important for saving disposable income from households, addressing the fuel poverty that was mentioned, but also reducing dependency on fuel imports because of reduced that. So it's basically a quadruple win, and it shows also the link between the sort of the social, climate, and economic, and it produces a lot of local jobs. So I think here, if the monies that have been allocated really do go into building restoration in a big way, then I think it can lead to a transformation. There's also a lot of other funds in a lot of other directions. I mean, there's renewables, there's public transport, there's active transport, and there's even some for circular economy. So each of these can lead to transformation. more widely as people see the multiple wins. But just to underline, I mean, the amount of money here is not sufficient to make this transformation. It's more of a catalyst and a symbol overall, even though it's very real money with very real impact. So we need to make sure we have a multiplier beyond this, and this gets back down to what the EIB can do, what the private sector do, what can households and national budgets do. But overarchingly, I think we've seen a solidarity in the response, a commitment positive. There are weaknesses in the process, but there always are, but we need to address them. But I think there's hope. And we just need to be vigilant now that this spending actually goes in the right place and follows good governance rules, so the money actually goes in the right way. And within that, my final element on that is we should make sure that linked to these processes that enough money goes to the sort of social issues. And I'm a supporter of the Climate Social Fund. I think the making sure that the social dimension is picked up is absolutely essential for the buy-in into this ecological transformation process. Thanks.
Thank you. Eila, Patrick mentioned, the role that the European Investment Bank can play in the context of this recovery effort, and you also mentioned earlier that the bank cannot operate in a vacuum. It requires the participation and active engagement of many other stakeholders. Do you think this recovery plan is what was needed, and how can the European Investment Bank help in achieving its objectives?
Yes, of course, that is a plan of the Commission between them and the member states. And as Patrick was saying, it is a good plan. There's plenty of money, but is it enough yet? Probably not, or it is not. We need more. And I think this is something that one needs to look at in every single decision that is being made, whether irrespective of where the money comes from the Commission, from the EIB, from private sector finance providers. You have to just mainstream it so that it is every single decision making is taking this into account. And but I think we are always just thinking that we have some huge things to finance, and this is just a big hole of money. This will also create opportunities. This will also create jobs. We don't see all of that yet. It's perfectly normal. But I think everybody agrees that we need partial solution from the side of new technologies, and I think this will also create new jobs. I'll just take one example. When we went from landline phones into mobile phones, and the first and the pretty much for a long time, the only advantage that everybody thought was that, well, I can speak on the phone wherever I am. I'm skiing in the mountains, I'm fishing on the lake, I can speak on the phone. But had that been the only advantage, we would not have had the whole industry of different services that are provided, the application, everything that works on the mobile phones, people who create them, who update them, who create the artificial intelligence space and the algorithmics, with good or bad. This whole thing has created just a huge industry and huge number of jobs, which we could not see 20 years ago. And I think we have a little bit of the same here with this energy and energy efficiency and climate transition, that we only see the sort of the black holes where the money must go, and we see the big investment needs. We do not see yet what else it provides, and it will be there. So to me, this is just clear that it has to be. We don't have those decisions where we think that we can still take a bit of time. Then we have the decisions or the investments where we think that, okay, this is very green, we will do this now. It has to be part of every single decision making and every single euro spent. Otherwise, we are not going to get there. So that's my thesis.
Thank you very much. Mauro, I'll be interested to hear your take also on the recovery plan that the EU has put in place. The Commission was very much involved, and obviously, there's points made about making sure that its application now is appropriate and efficient. And again, that's something the Commission can certainly help with. How do you view those efforts? And do you think this can be a turning point? Can we mobilize that money to really make our economies more sustainable and efficient?
Well, first of all, let me say that Patrick's analysis of what needs to be done in the short term and Eila's view of where we should aim in the longer term are absolutely spot on. I couldn't, if I tried, I couldn't say anything any better, so I'm not going to try. So let me add a couple of points, more examples of how we see that actually working. I mean, first of all, yes, the Next Generation EU and the RRP were a turning point. Were a turning point also in other ways. Patrick was underlying it all started with solidarity. If you recall the discussions on budget we were having in February 2019, when we should already known about the pandemic and we were pretending not to, the discussion we were having then was a horror. Solidarity was out of the window. We were really worrying about what that would do to European cohesion. Having reacted to a really, really bad crisis in a way that overcomes that situation and brings us back into the solidarity, which is the essence of the European project, it's hugely important. Can we keep that? The next big discussion is going to be on how do we restart and under what condition the Stability Pact. This is coming. How we handle that is going to be the proof of whether we can keep that spirit for the long term or not. When you look at what Eila was saying about every single euro has been spent in the right direction, and that's what mainstreaming means. We are at the initial stage of mainstreaming, where we are calculating how many resources go to climate and how many go to something else. But strategically, that is still the wrong approach. Climate change is not one goal additional and in competition with our other goals. It's a different way of achieving the goals that we want to achieve, whether they are prosperity, economic growth, job creation, solidarity, social justice, fairness, economic justice. We have to do all this in a way that helps stop climate change and does not reproduce the problem. That is the true meaning of mainstreaming, but it also applies to technologies. I mean, look at Eila made the example of the impact of mobile telephony on the high-tech industry. We're not going to be able to live without that. We don't want to live without that anymore, even though we're beginning to see that it's not all joy and happiness. But we are now concentrating on decarbonizing the problems of today, which we have inherited from yesterday. And they're still the biggest problems. But the digital industry is growing as a climate threat in terms of its energy consumption. Now, fortunately, that's an industry that's aware of that, and it's playing an important role in reducing energy consumption, but the growth of digital activity is outstripping that. That is going to be one of the challenges for the medium term, because we don't want a clean society back to candleworks. We want a modern, clean society. So get into our mind that mainstreaming climate change is a way of living, and not a problem which needs to be solved. And once it's solved, we can move on to something else. I don't think we're there yet. Perhaps the younger generations are, but as they are fond of pointing out, they're not yet in control of politics and the economy. So I think we have to make a bigger effort to get that more explicitly into the public consciousness.
Earlier in our conversation, you mentioned, Mauro, that public opinion across Europe is very much in favor of action to tackle the climate crisis. And the recent Eurobarometer poll confirms that, where we saw across all demographics, climate change being one of the main issues of concern for European citizens. And I believe, as one of our viewers, Bea, is commenting, 90% of young people, in fact, consider it to be a priority. This is also reflected in the Conference on the Future of Europe that is currently taking place. For those of our viewers who might not be familiar with it, it's a process that the EU has started to consult about what the EU should be doing to improve the European Union going forward. And it has put in place various innovations, including setting up European citizens panels of randomly selected citizens who come together to debate various issues, including the environment. And in this conference, you see also a lot how keen citizens are to ensure that we respond to the climate crisis we are going through, both for ourselves and for future generations. So maybe this was perhaps a long way, Mauro, to come back to your point on public support and ask you to comment a little bit on that. I don't know how closely you follow the Conference on the Future of Europe, but certainly the citizens panels tackling the environment have been very vocal on this issue and coming forward with interesting proposals. Do you think this is also an opportunity to enhance our democracy and give more responsibility to citizens in coming forward with policy solutions to address climate change?
Yes, it is. That's a short answer. The longer answer is that if we want to first of all, if I look from the narrow, so to speak, point of view of climate change, my greatest preoccupation is our ability to keep focus on that in the longer term. Is the threat of fatigue, because most ordinary people want to live a life. They don't want to spend their time worrying about the catastrophe happening. How do we keep them concentrated on the catastrophe without depriving them of the lifestyle they want to have? I think it's a big political problem. In that perspective, we need a panoply of different instruments. We need institutional occasions like the Conference on the Future of Europe to bring citizens into the institutions directly, not only through the mediation of the representative democracy. This has to be added. NGOs play their role. We all know that. We know it. So no need to reinvent that particular wheel. But we also need people, frankly, to take to the streets. In the demonstrations, especially by the youth, but not only, because in Madrid, for instance, it wasn't just the young people in the streets. They were there with their parents and their grandparents to express themselves. And this was a gigantic exercise in constructive public expression. Critical, of course, but constructive. So I think we need a variety of things. The most difficult question, and related to your question, Petros, is how do we use the Conference of Europe outcome? That is a very difficult issue. It's a very political issue, not only for the institution, but also for the member states. Because citizens have a right and perhaps a duty to put difficult questions and extreme demands. They have a right to simply say, there's a problem, fix it. And it's not their problem to explain to us how. We have to explain to them how we're going to fix that problem to their satisfaction. That kind of back and forth is fraught with difficulties, and it's going to be a big challenge. And I think the Conference on the Future of Europe, the citizen panel, are bringing that challenge to the fore. And I don't expect a perfect outcome. I expect an outcome that brings us forward and makes people, maybe there were still grouse about the lack of responsiveness of the institutions, but they will come out with the exercise thinking that, yes, Europe is useful for what they want, and they're getting something that they want out of Europe. It may not be everything that everybody wants, but I hope that we'll be able to come out with the majority thinking that this has been useful and that they have been heard. In many cases, people don't expect that they say X and X happens. They expect that X gets taken into account in the decision.
Yeah. And there was an issue there was a session just this past weekend of the conference that I myself and the European Movement and others were attending, and you could see from the citizens that they were aware that some of their proposals were ambitious and innovative, and they wanted to engage in dialogue about what's possible and what is not. But I think the sense of the responsibility was felt inside the room among all stakeholders that we need to act upon these recommendations, or at least we need to explain what we would like to do and how we are going to make them a reality. Patrick, I know that the European Environmental Bureau is also involved in the conference, and you have seen the recommendations on the environment and on climate change. How do you view the process, and perhaps what is it that civil society can do to help deliver on some of the recommendations that the citizens are making in that context?
Okay, no, thanks very much. Yes, my colleague Petriccione is very core to the conference, The Future of Europe, and I sort of engaged on a Saturday morning to discuss with a range of citizens on this. I think the key thing is for us to what NGOs can do with civil society. Well, let's start a different way. I think the process itself is a very important example of deliberative democracy, of trying to engage and successfully engaging with citizens to explore sort of a common vision. And I think it's important for the health of democracy that there is more of this. So I think this should be seen as a first go at deliberative democracy, and we should listen to it. We should make sure we have the results. And I think this is where civil society plays a role, because we know what the recommendations are, and we also know what the various different policy windows and processes are to get their voice heard and into the process. So we've heard about the requests. We already mentioned building restoration, but the major uptake of renewables, we know we have to communicate this in all venues possible around the Fit for 55. It's been proven that 100% renewables grid is possible by 2040, so we just need to operationalize it. And so I think there's a key issue to communicate that, but also maybe add one other dimension, which we haven't totally picked upon yet, is there are a number of technological solutions which are there, but I think we need to think more broadly than just technology. There's also techniques, and if you match supply demand, it's not only by producing more for demand, it's also trying to think of the wider equation. And I think some of the recommendations look into that. We also need to really invest on the energy efficiency side. Circular economy solutions can be put in there. The wider issue of sufficiency is something that needs to address. So in matching supply and demand, sometimes you may only actually need half of the supply, because you can actually avoid future demand. So I think what we need to do is to listen to this process and communicate them and push them into the various different policy windows now and make sure they're heeded, but then to keep this dialogue going at whatever level is appropriate, to keep engaging, and then to communicate back to the citizens what's actually being achieved, because this is essential. It also, the European elections are coming around in 2 years' time. We need to also show that Europe does actually invest in the future for citizens. It does actually heed the citizens' voices, and then any MEPs who embrace sort of a transformative agenda should hopefully then be supported, because that's what we need, and that's of course the greatest part of democracy. So I don't know if I've totally answered the question, but I think that it needs to be a constant dialogue, and we need to strengthen it. I'm not saying we have to all become Swiss, because they've got a remarkable model, but I think there's a lot we can do to make a vibrant and healthy democracy, and having a deliberative democracy and citizen engagement is essential for the legitimacy of our democracy. Thanks.
Indeed, and I think it's that complementary element that deliberative democracy can add to the participatory democracy and the contribution that organized civil society, social partners, and other stakeholders can make together with the institutions, of course, in national governments. We're running out of time, and I wanted to pick one of the questions from our audience. Carl is asking that a lot of emissions come from cities, and the recent COP26 was attended by several mayors and local government representatives. And Carl is asking, what can the European Commission, the European Investment Bank do to help local governments reduce their emissions and reach zero carbon as soon as possible? Perhaps, Eila, I can start with you.
Yeah. Yes. Well, we were plenty with local authorities, be it in cities or regions, other municipalities, and especially on public transport, which is, of course, the idea is to reduce private car usage and get to a more sustainable mode of transport. We do energy efficiency projects with cities and governments, local governments, to save energy on the public buildings. We have done even some sort of biodiversity restoration projects with the cities. We have just recently set up, I think, a couple of weeks ago, not more, with a commission, a sort of a center of expertise or a center of advice for cities, how to improve the circular economy in the cities. I think it's called C3, and I'm pretty sure that one C comes from cities, another comes from circular, but I'm not sure what the third C comes from, but C3. So we work in all this field, and as Patrick said, they are all interlinked. Climate change and biodiversity and circular economy, they are all very much intertwined and interlinked. So we work on all these fronts, basically the areas where you need large investment programs and where you need a technical expertise. This is what EIB is really best at. So those are we of course we work with the municipalities, with other like sectors like healthcare and education. But when we talk about climate and environment now, these are the areas where we have by far the largest volumes and also very good expertise.
Indeed. Mauro, how can the Commission also support local governments, cities, and other stakeholders at the local and regional level to contribute in our efforts to go carbon zero?
Well, for a start, we've been instrumental in helping the European Covenant of Mayors to establish itself. With finance, with advice, we have seconded officials to the Secretariat of the Covenant, and we continue to do so. We've also been instrumental in the merger between the European Covenant and the Global Compact of Mayors in what is now the Global Covenant of Mayors. We were helped in that effect financially by the Bloomberg philanthropies, but now with the restructuring of the partnership, Bloomberg will be involved in financing concrete projects, but the entire administrative support, the entire support to keeping the not only the European but the worldwide network functioning has been taken over by the Commission. So we're being very active in helping cities to get organized, and the Covenant is literally exploding. The next frontier is regional government, because when we talk about the local government, there are different realities and they articulate themselves differently. There are also European resources devoted to it, but the key question is not so much more resources, is how are those resources being used? What is the ability of cities to plan their climate action and to plan in a way that answers the need of citizens for mobility, for a decent living environment, for economic growth, for jobs, for services. And there, I think there's a huge amount of work still needs to be done. There are some success stories. The 2013 adaptation strategy managed to help all member states to set up a national adaptation strategy, and we've lost count about how many local adaptation strategies exist. We're going to double up on that with the strategy which has been approved last year. We will now give cities a prominent place on the Climate Pact platform, which has come in operation in an experimental manner last year. We are now looking at the results of the first year of operation, and we have big plans to expand the platform to make it more interactive. And the platform is there for anybody who wants to use it, whether it's individual citizen, association, schools, cities, whoever. But we also have our own plans for the platform, and one big priority for us is to make sure it is used by cities to communicate with each other for joint action, which can go from joint procurement of street lighting, I'm quoting a real example, to joint procurement of clean buses, to the ability to plan on adaptation and on changes to the urban landscape for the great mass of small cities and towns who do not have a planning capacity. Because how many small towns can afford or need in reality a permanent plan? How do we network people together and support the network so that the planning capacity which exists can be used also by others? Because that is the key point. Cities can be extremely good at producing climate policy. The challenge of mobility will be won in the cities, not on the motorways. The challenge of road mobility. Bringing temperatures down in cities is crucial. Cities like Seoul have experimented with re-wetting the city, recreating channels and uncovering rivers, and they brought temperatures down by 5 degrees in some parts of the city. So there's plenty that would be done better at the local level. Do they have the knowledge? Do they have the ability to organize themselves? Do they have somebody they can go to for help, for support, for exchanging, for finding what solution be found somewhere else? And yes, at the end of the day, there has to be a measure of financial support. But as I was saying earlier, if you have a good project, the money can be found. Now, we have a very peculiar situation in Europe. We cannot use the traditional instruments that the European Union uses to support member states because of our institutional reality. Our interlocutors are the member states, not our institutional interlocutors. So we have to find innovative ways of talking to cities and regions together with member states in a way that does not affect the constitutional balance of member states. It's a bit complicated, but it's extremely productive and extremely rewarding. And I think there's a real frontier there for both adaptation and mitigation, which is vastly underexploited.
Indeed. And I think that's a good message to end our conversation. We haven't been able to go through everything we want to discuss, and 1 hour is never enough. But I certainly hope this will be the first of many chats among us. The initiative Invest in the Future of Europe that we are running together with the European Investment Bank will continue, and I encourage you all to engage both on social media, but also by visiting the European Movement's website, the europeanmovement.eu, or the dedicated website for this initiative, investing in the future.eu. And the only thing left to me to do is to thank all three of our speakers for the very honest, open, informative, and thought-through contributions. This discussion is indeed of huge importance, and we look forward to working with all of you to continue advancing what Europe can do to address climate change. In the meantime, and until then, I wish you all a good evening, and I look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thanks again for joining us. Have a good afternoon.